I shouldn't still remember the way their eyes looked, but I do. I remember them the moment I wake up, the moment I try to fall asleep, and especially now when I'm finally admitting what happened. If you've ever felt the world tilt just slightly, like something is watching you from inside the dark, then you already know how my life began to unravel. I grew up mostly unnoticed. I don't say that for pity. It's just the truth. I was the kind of kid who blended into corners, the one teachers forgot to mark as present, the one who sat at the edge of the cafeteria, tracing shapes on the table just to feel like I existed. There was a quiet comfort in being invisible, even if it came with a sting. I spent more hours alone than any child should, drifting through days like a ghost in my own house. My mother worked nights. My father drifted through jobs like a leaf caught in a restless current. I learned early that silence filled the gaps adults didn't want to notice. I filled my own gaps with long walks, paths through fields, trails through the woods behind our town. That's where the world felt less like it was pressing down on me. The woods behind Cannock Chase had a strange pull on me, even before I understood why. The trees were spaced just unevenly enough to make the shadows restless. The air always felt slightly cooler than the rest of town. When I think back on it now, I realize the quiet there wasn't normal. It wasn't gentle or peaceful. It was thick, heavy, expectant. But as a lonely kid, I thought it was the only place that matched the stillness inside my chest. I spent entire afternoons walking those paths, kicking at leaves, counting roots, brushing my hands along rough bark. It sounds sad now, but being there felt safer than being anywhere else. The world didn't notice me, and the forest didn't demand anything. It just let me fade into it. Then one evening something shifted. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud. It was just wrong. I was headed down the narrow trail near the old quarry, the one I wasn't supposed to take because the ground there liked to give way under careless feet. The sun was low, turning the branches into long, skeletal shapes. I remember thinking the shadows looked like arms reaching for me, stretched thin and trembling. I stepped on a patch of soft earth. It sank slightly under my shoe, and for a moment I thought I'd slip. But the ground held. The air, however, changed. Not the temperature, something deeper. The entire forest seemed to pause, like it was holding its breath. That was the moment I first heard it. A faint tap. Then another. Like fingertips brushing tree bark in a slow, careful rhythm. Tap, pause, tap. The sound came from behind me. But when I turned, nothing moved. No branches swayed, no leaves fluttered. Even the birds had gone silent. I froze, waiting for something, anything, to break that unbearable stillness. Tap. This time it came from the side of the trail. Closer. Near the old stump I always used as a marker to know I wasn't lost. I stared at the stump for what felt like a full minute. My heartbeat started to rise, slow but heavy, like it was waking up from a long sleep. I took one step back, then another. The tapping stopped, but something else began. Breathing, not loud, not aggressive, just deliberate. A slow inhale, a slower exhale, the sound of someone standing too close to be a stranger and too still to be human. I told myself it was the wind shifting through the trees, but I couldn't lie to myself about the shape I saw in the corner of my eye, a shape small enough to be a child, but still enough to feel wrong. Children move. They fidget. They twitch. This shape stood like a statue, carved from darkness. I blinked to clear my vision. When my eyes opened, the shape was gone. I walked home faster than usual, each step feeling like I was dragging myself out of something thick and invisible. By the time I reached my street, the tapping had stopped, but the pressure hadn't. I could still feel it on my back, like the air itself had memorized my shape. It didn't end there. It never does. Because that night, when I finally fell asleep, the first nightmare came. I was standing in the same woods, only the trees leaned closer, like they were listening. The sky was the color of bruised skin, and in front of me stood a figure, small, still, too close to recognize at first. I tried to step back, but my feet felt rooted in the ground. The figure lifted its head, slowly, too slowly, and then I saw the eyes, glossy, empty, entirely black, so dark they swallowed the faint light around them. They didn't blink, they didn't widen, they simply stared. I woke with my throat tight and my hands shaking. My room should have felt safe, but the shadows didn't look like shadows anymore. They looked like places something could be hiding, watching, waiting. For weeks I tried to pretend it was just a dream, just imagination from an overactive, lonely kid. But dreams don't follow you. Dreams don't show up in places you should feel protected. And dreams don't knock. It was a soft sound, barely a tap, but it came from my bedroom window, the one that overlooked the backyard, the one that was too high off the ground for anyone to reach, the one I never touched because the latch was old and rusted and impossible to open. Tap. I froze in bed, my heart crawling up my throat. I forced myself not to move, not to breathe too loudly. I stared at the window, waiting for a second sound. Seconds passed, maybe minutes, maybe longer. Then I saw it, a silhouette in the glass, small, still, tilted just slightly, like it was studying me. I squeezed my eyes shut, hard, the way I used to when I was little, and thought that if I couldn't see the world, maybe it couldn't see me. But I felt its presence. I felt it waiting. When morning came, the window was empty, but the imprint of something cold lingered on the glass, a faint shape roughly where a hand might have rested. I tried to ignore it. I really did. But ignoring something doesn't erase it. It only teaches it how to get closer. I didn't know then that the figure wasn't a stranger. I didn't know it was someone I used to trust, someone whose memory carried more shadows than light. I didn't know the forest was only the beginning. I didn't know the eyes were just the first thing I was meant to see. I didn't know the truth was already inside my house, already inside my life, already inside me. I kept telling myself the window imprint could have been anything, a smudge, condensation, a trick of the light. But lies only work when your body believes them, and mine refused. My pulse moved differently now, beating with a rhythm that didn't feel like mine. My thoughts came in fragments, like something inside me had shifted out of place. Even the morning sun felt wrong, too bright and too sharp, as if it were trying to expose something I wasn't ready to face. School didn't help. If anything, it made everything worse. I sat through classes unable to focus, hiding my trembling hands under my desk. The world around me blurred. People moved in soft waves, voices blending into a distant hum that my mind couldn't hold on to. Every reflective surface caught my gaze. Glass doors, windows, even the polished metal of a water fountain, each one felt like an opening, a place where something could be looking back. The nightmares didn't stop. They blended into waking moments until I couldn't tell which was which. Sometimes I would blink and see the shape of a small figure at the edge of my vision. Sometimes I would sense a presence behind me, only to turn and find nothing but empty air. But the worst moments were the ones when I felt cold. Not the kind you get from weather or drafts. This cold felt intentional, directed at me, sliding beneath my skin like invisible fingers. One afternoon, while walking home, the pressure returned. It came from the tree line near the entrance to Cannock Chase. The same forest I used to lean on for comfort now felt alive in a different way, as if every branch was bending slightly toward me. I felt the faint tremor of the ground beneath my shoes. The air wrapped around my neck, thin and silent. I forced myself to keep moving. The closer I got to home, the more the pressure tightened. It felt like being followed by something weightless yet heavy, something that didn't need footsteps to stay close. I walked faster. My breaths came shallow, my chest tightening in a way I'd never felt before. By the time I reached my yard, the silence pressed so loudly against my ears that I nearly stumbled up the steps. Inside, the house felt strangely empty. Not quiet, not peaceful empty. Like the rooms had been drained of something invisible and essential. The walls felt thinner. The shadows felt thicker. Even the air felt heavier, as if it had been waiting for me. My backpack slipped off my shoulder. I let it fall. I didn't even bother taking my shoes off. I stood in the hallway, unable to keep moving, sensing something behind me in the dimness of the living room doorway. A faint shift, too slow, too deliberate. I didn't look. I couldn't. My neck refused to obey. Instead, I stared at the floor and listened to the soft creak of wooden boards settling beneath a weight that wasn't mine. The sound stopped. I swallowed my throat tight. My body felt suspended between two decisions, run or stay still, but neither felt safe. Neither felt possible. Eventually, I forced myself to go to my room. The door closed behind me with a soft click that felt too gentle, too careful. I leaned against the wall, trying to steady my breathing. The imprint on the window was still there. Even though the glass was clean everywhere else, that faint shape remained, almost like it was growing sharper. I sat on the edge of my bed, running my fingers across the blanket to ground myself. And that was when I noticed something I had missed earlier. My pillow had been moved, only by an inch, but enough to notice. Enough to know I hadn't done it. Enough to feel my stomach twist into a tight knot. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to every tiny sound the house made. Every settling board, every faint groan. My body stayed tense, expecting something to reach out from the dark. Hours passed in slow, suffocating waves. And then it happened again. Tap. This time it didn't come from the window. It came from the hallway, soft, precise, right outside my door. Tap. My breath caught. My fingers curled into the blanket until my nails dug into the fabric. I stared at the door, imagining a small hand resting against the other side, imagining a figure standing just inches away, listening to my heartbeat through the wood. The tapping stopped. Silence followed, thick, wet, heavy. Then the handle moved, not enough to open, just enough to shift. A slow, deliberate tilt downward. I didn't make a sound. I didn't blink. My entire body froze as the handle held its lowered position for several seconds before rising again, just as slowly. The hallway returned to stillness, but the room felt smaller, compressed, as if something had stepped through the walls instead of the door. At some point near dawn, exhaustion dragged me into sleep, and when I dreamed, I saw the figure again. But this time it wasn't just standing in the woods. It was standing in my childhood living room. The lighting was dim, washed in a dusty orange haze. The furniture looked older, worn. The carpet had a stain I recognized from years before, one nobody ever bothered to clean. The figure's head tilted toward me with that same unnatural slowness, the same black eyes, the same empty expression. But then I saw something new, the shape of its face, the curve of its jaw, the familiar softness around its mouth. It looked like someone I knew, someone whose memory I had buried beneath everything I didn't want to feel, someone I hadn't thought about in years. My breath hitched even in the dream. I felt my knees weaken. The figure took one small step forward, its form flickering like a reflection on unsteady water. I tried to back away. My body didn't move. The room darkened, shadows stretching long and thin across the floor. The figure's face shifted, as though it couldn't decide which version of itself it wanted to show me. I woke with my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might break through my ribs. Sweat clung to my hairline. My mouth tasted like metal. My whole body trembled. For a long time I just sat there, hugging my knees to my chest, trying to piece myself back together. The sky outside had begun to lighten, but the pale morning sun didn't comfort me. It only made my room look emptier, like the shadows had retreated but not disappeared, like they were hiding just out of sight, waiting for night to return. I told myself I needed answers. I needed to understand what this figure was, why it looked familiar, why it kept getting closer, why it chose me. But I also knew that some answers don't heal. Some only deepen the wounds you tried to pretend weren't there. And the more I thought about its face, the more an old memory began to rise, the kind I had tried to bury so deep it would never surface. The memory of someone who used to stand in doorways just like that, watching me, studying me, waiting for me to notice. I wasn't ready to face that truth yet, but the figure was, and it wasn't done with me. I stopped pretending anything was normal. The figure wasn't just a shadow following me. It wasn't just a nightmare that leaked into waking hours. It was a presence that understood me far too well, my habits, my fears, the weak points in my memory I thought I had sealed away. And every day it grew more confident, stepping into my space, into my thoughts, into places I never wanted it to reach. My home stopped feeling like a home. Every corner looked wrong. Every object felt misplaced even when it wasn't. The air held a faint cold that never matched the temperature outside. I'd walk through the hallway and swear I felt breath on the back of my neck. I'd pass the bathroom mirror and feel watched even when I avoided looking into the glass. The tapping returned at random hours, sometimes at the window, sometimes on the floorboards beneath my bed, sometimes from inside my closet. But the worst part wasn't the sounds. It was the silence between them, long, measured stretches of stillness that felt like the figure was thinking, planning, remembering. My appetite disappeared. Sleep became a fragile, dangerous thing. My mind drifted through the day like a body floating in dark water, waiting to brush against something cold beneath the surface. I knew the world around me could see I was slipping, but nobody asked why. Nobody wanted to. People prefer their monsters hidden away where they don't have to acknowledge them. I learned to move quietly, to breathe softly, to avoid turning my back to dark spaces, but none of it mattered. The figure always found me. One evening I was sitting on the floor of my room with the lights off, the curtains drawn, trying to steady the frantic beat of my heart. The house creaked, but this time I felt the shift, not random, not natural. Something changed in the density of the air. My chest tightened. I felt it before I heard it. A faint weight settling onto the floorboards behind me. Slow, controlled, close. The cold spread across my back like a shadow crawling over my skin. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare breathe too deeply. My eyes focused on the faint strip of light under my door, the only thing grounding me in the moment. Then the breathing started again. Soft, steady, inches away from me. My pulse pounded so hard it hurt. The pressure built in my ears, a low ringing growing louder by the second. I felt something brush my sleeve. A whisper-light touch, curious, careful, as if trying to confirm I was real. I squeezed my eyes shut. My breath hitched. My fingers dug into the carpet. When the touch left, the cold remained. I waited, seconds, minutes, I don't know how long. Eventually the weight lifted, the presence faded. But something lingered, something I couldn't ignore anymore. It wanted me to remember. Not the nightmares, not the forest. Someone from before the woods, before the tapping, before the figure. A memory I had buried under layers of silence. I didn't want to go back there, but the figure kept pulling me toward it, like a hand reaching through years of dust and shadows. I couldn't resist any longer. That night, sleep didn't come gently. It dragged me under like a cold tide. My room dissolved into darkness, and when the world returned, I was standing in a different place. A living room washed in gray. Furniture arranged in a way that made my chest tighten. A smell I hadn't sensed in years, damp fabric, old wood. Something metallic lingering under the surface. I knew this place, my childhood home, before everything changed, before the silence became a survival strategy, before I learned not to meet certain eyes too long. There was a figure seated on the old couch, back facing me, shoulders too still, too small. I felt the floor tilt beneath my feet as recognition hit me. I didn't want to approach, but my dream self moved without permission, drawn by something deeper than fear. The figure slowly turned its head. The same tilt, the same slow, unnatural movement I had seen in the woods, at my window, outside my door. Only this time the face came into focus. It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't a creature from the forest. It was a child I used to know, a child who never smiled, a child who always stood too close to me in the hallway, breathing differently than the rest of us, a child whose eyes were always dark, not just in color, but in depth, a child who would appear in my doorway at night without explanation, watching, waiting, listening to the house creak and shift, listening to me breathe. I had forgotten them, completely erased them. My mind had protected me by burying that memory so deep I thought it never existed. But they existed. I remembered the day they vanished from my life. No goodbye, no explanation. Just gone, adults whispered. Neighbors speculated, but nobody told me anything. And I forced myself not to ask, because something inside me knew their presence was never supposed to be understood. In the dream, the child stood and faced me fully, But their eyes, those eyes were the same as the figure that had been haunting me. Completely black, reflective, empty of anything human. Their mouth didn't move, but I felt something being pressed into my mind, a memory I had never wanted to retrieve. I was younger, standing near the forest edge. The child was beside me, their small hand gripping mine with a force that felt wrong. Their eyes already darker than they should have been, their breath cold in the warm air. They whispered something into my shoulder, not words, not sounds, but intent. A promise that they would return. A promise that they weren't done with me. A promise that they'd find me again when the world forgot them. My childhood self had pulled away, frightened. But it was too late. Something had already passed between us. A bond, a mark, a shadow that didn't depend on memory to survive. When I woke, my room was still dark. My throat felt tight, my limbs heavy. I stared at the ceiling, unable to move, knowing that nothing I remembered could be undone now. The figure wasn't just haunting me. It was reclaiming something it believed belonged to it, something I had unknowingly carried with me all these years. The tapping came again. I felt the vibration through the plaster, a small hand pressing down, testing the distance between us. The air thickened until every breath scraped the inside of my chest. And then, for the first time, I heard a sound I hadn't heard since childhood. A slow slide, like something dragging its palm across the ceiling, tracing my exact position beneath it. My heartbeat stuttered. My skin prickled. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I lay frozen as the sliding continued, mapping me, memorizing every inch of where I lay. When it stopped, the silence dropped like a heavy curtain. I waited. The darkness pressed closer. Then the ceiling cracked. Just a hairline fracture, small, thin, but directly above my face. Dust drifted down, landing on my cheek like the faintest exhale. The presence lowered itself closer, pressing at the fragile barrier between us. I knew then that there was no outrunning this, no forgetting it again, no finding safety in light or distance or denial. The figure had followed me for years, through dreams, through silence, through memories I didn't want to keep. And now it had found a way in. The ceiling creaked above me, bending almost imperceptibly, as if something was pushing through, determined to enter my world fully. I realized something I had always sensed but never admitted. It wasn't haunting me. It wasn't following me. It was coming back for me because I had once belonged to it, because I had once seen its true form, because it needed me to remember what I truly was to it. The room darkened even more. The crack widened. Dust fell in a thin line across my chest, and I understood the truth. It had never left the house. It had never left me. It had only been waiting for the moment I stopped pretending it wasn't real. The ceiling bowed downward, and I knew without a sound, without a face, without a word, that it was finally ready to step into my world again. And this time it wasn't going to let me go. You won't believe me when I say the moment that destroyed my life didn't begin with anything loud or violent. It started with a tiny click on a radio that should have been silent. It was so small, so thin, I almost convinced myself I imagined it. But something in that sound felt intentional, like a fingertip tapping the inside of my skull. It pulled me in before I had a chance to protect myself. Loneliness had shaped most of my childhood. A quiet house, an exhausted mother, an empty chair where another parent once sat. I used to fall asleep to the low hum of an old analog radio because it was the only thing that made the walls feel less suffocating. I depended on that static more than I ever admitted. Maybe that's why the click felt personal, like something had been waiting for me to listen. The room was cold that night, the window coated with frost that crept inward like pale veins. I sat with the radio on my lap, spinning the dial in slow circles just to hear any human sound. But all I found was static, a soft snowstorm of noise, until the click cut straight through it. Then came a second one, then a thin inhale, not mine. It slipped out of the speaker so softly I felt it more than heard it, brushing across my skin like a breath delivered through wires. The inhale stretched, followed by faint movement on the other end, something shifting with slow patience, as if adjusting to listen back. I froze. The house felt smaller. Even the air seemed to pull tight around me. For a moment I thought the sound was a trick of my exhaustion, but it continued with steady, unnatural rhythm, too controlled to be mechanical, too deliberate to be accidental. When fear finally forced my hand, I yanked the cord from the wall. The breathing continued for several more seconds. That was when a cold, sinking certainty took root inside me. I hadn't found a frequency. Something had found me. The next day passed in a haze. I carried the memory like a bruise beneath my ribs. Every humming light fixture, every old speaker mounted on a ceiling, every distant static-filled noise reminded me of that breath. I tried to convince myself I had imagined it. I tried to pretend the tension in my spine was nothing but leftover childhood nerves. By evening, I ended up in front of the radio again, despite every instinct screaming not to. I told myself I only wanted to prove it was broken, that nothing was actually there. Yet my hand shook as I reached for the plug, as if some deeper part of me already understood the danger. Before the cord touched the outlet, I felt it, a gentle vibration traveling through the desk, a slow thump-thump-thump like a heartbeat trapped inside the device. It pulsed only when I leaned closer, stopping the instant I pulled away. My chest tightened with the kind of dread that feels like falling backward into darkness. I plugged it in anyway. The bulbs flickered. Dust drifted. The radio remained dark for a moment, lifeless. Then the dial turned on its own with slow, careful movements, as though guided by a hand that wanted me to notice its precision. Static filled the room in a dense, suffocating wave. The breathing returned, sharper this time, closer, sensed to a subtle undertone, something shifting behind it with eerie patience. A dragging hum followed, low and distant, as if coming from a place too deep for ordinary sound. The air in my room changed. Pressure built in my ears, pushing inward until the world felt warped. The frost on the window thickened, spreading fast, cracking into strange, branching shapes that crawled across the glass like something trying to trace its way inside. Then the radio trembled with a final deliberate pulse. In that moment, something inside the sound shifted, not louder, not clearer, but aware, as if whatever existed on that buried frequency had finally recognized me as the one who heard it. And I felt it closing in dot, not through the speaker, through the walls, dot through the air, through the space behind me where no one should have been. I shouldn't still remember the way their eyes looked, but I do. I remember them the moment I wake up, the moment I try to fall asleep, and especially now when I'm finally admitting what happened. If you've ever felt the world tilt just slightly, like something is watching you from inside the dark, then you already know how my life began to unravel. I grew up mostly unnoticed. I don't say that for pity. It's just the truth. I was the kind of kid who blended into corners, the one teachers forgot to mark as present, the one who sat at the edge of the cafeteria, tracing shapes on the table just to feel like I existed. There was a quiet comfort in being invisible, even if it came with a sting. I spent more hours alone than any child should, drifting through days like a ghost in my own house. My mother worked nights. My father drifted through jobs like a leaf caught in a restless current. I learned early that silence filled the gaps adults didn't want to notice. I filled my own gaps with long walks, paths through fields, trails through the woods behind our town. That's where the world felt less like it was pressing down on me. The woods behind Cannock Chase had a strange pull on me, even before I understood why. The trees were spaced just unevenly enough to make the shadows restless. The air always felt slightly cooler than the rest of town. When I think back on it now, I realize the quiet there wasn't normal. It wasn't gentle or peaceful. It was thick, heavy, expectant. But as a lonely kid, I thought it was the only place that matched the stillness inside my chest. I spent entire afternoons walking those paths, kicking at leaves, counting roots, brushing my hands along rough bark. It sounds sad now, but being there felt safer than being anywhere else. The world didn't notice me, and the forest didn't demand anything. It just let me fade into it. Then one evening, something shifted. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud. It was just wrong. I was headed down the narrow trail near the old quarry, the one I wasn't supposed to take because the ground there liked to give way under careless feet. The sun was low, turning the branches into long, skeletal shapes. I remember thinking the shadows looked like arms reaching for me, stretched thin and trembling. I stepped on a patch of soft earth. It sank slightly under my shoe, and for a moment I thought I'd slip, but the ground held. The air, however, changed. Not the temperature, something deeper. The entire forest seemed to pause, like it was holding its breath. That was the moment I first heard it, a faint tap, then another, like fingertips brushing tree bark in a slow, careful rhythm. Tap, pause, tap. The sound came from behind me. But when I turned, nothing moved. No branches swayed. No leaves fluttered. Even the birds had gone silent. I froze, waiting for something, anything, to break that unbearable stillness. Tap. This time it came from the side of the trail. Closer. Near the old stump I always used as a marker to know I wasn't lost. I stared at the stump for what felt like a full minute. My heartbeat started to rise, slow but heavy, like it was waking up from a long sleep. I took one step back, then another. The tapping stopped, but something else began. The air behind me felt heavier, as if someone had exhaled slowly into the back of my neck. I stood perfectly still, afraid to move, afraid to acknowledge the shift happening within the room. The radio hissed softly, the static rolling like distant wind across a barren place I could almost picture. A place where nothing living stood, only signals drifting through emptiness, searching for someone willing to listen. My childhood taught me to endure silence, but this wasn't silence. This was presence, a quiet that pressed, observed, waited. A quiet that felt aware of my pulse, my breath, my fear. The frost on the window kept spreading in jagged lines, forming shapes that didn't look natural. Angles that curved inward, spiraling around an invisible center. Even as a child, I had imagined things in patterns, faces in wallpaper, silhouettes in tree branches, but these shapes weren't like the ones I used to invent. They were too deliberate, too symmetrical, almost precise. The radio pulsed again, a low vibration that traveled through my feet into the floorboards. The hum beneath the breathing began to shift pitch, rising and falling in slow, unsettling waves, as if the source of the sound was drifting closer through layers I had no name for. Something inside me tightened. A memory surfaced those nights when I sat alone in that same room, years earlier, wishing someone would notice me, hoping for a presence that might sit beside me in the dark. A painful wish shaped by too many evenings staring at an empty doorway, wondering if fractures and silence could ever fill the spaces people left behind. I had spent so long wanting to be heard, and now something was hearing me. Something that shouldn't have. The static thinned, stretching into a soft, distant hiss. My chest grew tight, not from fear alone, but from recognition. It was the same feeling I had when I used to wait for my mother to come home late, hoping her footsteps would reach the door, knowing they often didn't. That blend of hope and dread, the feeling that someone might appear at any moment, yet knowing they probably wouldn't. Only now something was approaching. The hum deepened into a slow rhythm, pulsing like a signal sent through a long corridor. My fingertips tingled. The room dimmed, shadows pulling inward toward the desk as though drawn to the sound. The walls seemed closer, the ceiling lower. My breathing came uneven, fogging the air in pale bursts, even though the heater was running. I forced myself to look at the radio again. Its dial no longer moved, yet the signal held steady. The breathing on the other end deepened, rich and steady, carrying a strange weight. It felt like standing beside someone much larger than me, someone whose quiet presence filled every inch of space, someone familiar in shape, but wrong in ways I couldn't grasp. A distorted echo formed beneath the hum, like a memory being played backward. The sound vibrated inside my skull, stirring images I didn't want. My childhood room, dimly lit, my small hands gripping the radio dial, the hope that anyone was on the other end to make the house feel alive. I hadn't realized back then how dangerous that longing was, how it carved out a place in me that something else could one day occupy. The frost on the window thickened into a milky opacity, hiding the outside world completely. I couldn't tell if it was still night or already morning. Time inside the room thinned, until every second stretched with unnatural precision. The hum synchronized with my heartbeat, slow, deliberate, controlling. A sudden tremor ran through the desk, stronger than the previous ones. Papers fluttered, a pen rolled and fell. The vibration spread down the legs of the table, seeped into the floorboards, and pulsed up my spine like cold water. I felt it crawling up the back of my neck, reaching toward the base of my skull. The house had always been old creaking floors, settling walls, but the movement that rose through the room wasn't structural. It felt like something crossing through a threshold, like a presence stepping inside a space that had been denied for years. I didn't move. I couldn't. Every instinct urged me to run, but something held me still, not physically, but emotionally, as if leaving would mean abandoning the only thing that ever responded to me. The static thinned again, revealing a new layer beneath it. Not a word, not a phrase. Something formless, stretched from a place too far and too empty. It felt like someone reaching into a memory and twisting it, shaping it into a presence that resembled something I once trusted. It felt like coming face to face with a familiar outline, but with all the warmth drained away. A hollow version of someone I once longed for, a presence shaped like comfort, but built from cold. The room darkened further. Shadows gathered behind me, dense and low, as if the floor itself was lifting something upward. My heart pounded in sharp, irregular beats, each one hitting the back of my ribs like a warning I couldn't listen to. The hum deepened once more. The presence drew closer, settling just behind my shoulder, and for a moment, in that thick, suffocating quiet, I understood the truth. Whatever had reached me through that signal wasn't new. It had been waiting for years, waiting for the exact moment my loneliness thinned the barrier, enough for it to step through. And now it was here, inside the room, inside the breathless space behind my neck. It was no longer a sound. It was a figure shaped like a memory I never should have trusted. The shape behind me felt impossibly tall, stretching upward like a column of cold air pressed into the outline of a person. I felt its presence leaning close, not touching, but hovering with unbearable precision. My skin prickled. My ribs tightened as if the air itself had begun to narrow around me, funneling toward that figure that had no face, no form, only intent. A deep part of me recognized the outline, not from any real memory, but from the emptiness that shaped my childhood, the longing for someone to stand silently behind me, someone to watch over me, someone to break the silence of that narrow room where frost crept inward each winter. This figure felt carved from that longing, twisted into a warped, unnatural imitation of the comfort I once wished for. The radio pulsed again, the signal deepening, until it felt like a slow heartbeat pressing through the walls. The hum crawled up through the floor, through my spine, seeping into my skull. Shadows tightened inward, clinging to the figure behind me, giving its edges a shifting, wavering depth. The entire room strained toward it, as if drawn by a gravity of memory, fear, and recognition. The figure leaned closer. The breathing on the signal matched it perfectly, slow, steady, shaped around something hollow and resonant. The rhythm grew impossibly synchronized with my own pulse, until I couldn't tell which belonged to me and which belonged to it. My childhood returned in fragmented flashes, me sitting alone at the desk, tracing the patterns in the wallpaper, imagining a presence behind me, wishing for anyone to stand in that doorway to fill the silence. I never understood how dangerous that wish was, how it carved space inside me, a space that this figure now filled with unblinking patience. The frost on the window quivered. Thin cracks formed across the glass in spirals that mirrored the patterns on the radio's frequency display. The temperature dropped sharply, a cold so deep it felt like sinking underwater. Every breath scraped thin and metallic in my throat. The room dimmed further. The figure behind me thickened, its edges tightening, sharpening, becoming more pronounced than any shadow should ever be. I felt the faintest shift in the air, as if it inhaled deeply, savoring the moment it had waited so long for. I tried to step forward, but my legs barely responded, as though the space around me had stiffened, congealed into something that held me in place. My body felt heavy, rooted to the floor, not by physical force, but by the accumulated weight of years spent craving something to fill the silence. The hum intensified. Then the radio emitted a slow, rising tone, a tone that pierced straight through the center of my mind. The walls pulsed with it. The floorboards vibrated. The frost on the window blossomed into patterns that twisted like pale roots. My thoughts scrambled, slipping out of order. Memories blurred together. The smell of old books, the faint colors of my blankets, the nights I sat awake waiting for footsteps that never came. All of it mixed with the sound, forming a dense, oppressive haze that swallowed every coherent thought. Something touched the back of my neck, not skin, not breath. Not anything living. It was like a ripple of cold that pressed inward, sinking past the surface and into the bone. My vision flickered. The room twisted sideways for a moment, edges bending like a warped film reel. When it straightened, the shadows behind me had thickened into the unmistakable shape of someone standing far too close. The hum dropped into a deeper register, vibrating through my chest until I felt hollow. The breathing on the signal shifted, forming a pattern that resembled speech without forming recognizable words cadences, shaped by intention alone. A communication not meant for understanding, but for claiming. The figure leaned closer still. I felt its presence lowering itself to my ear. No sound escaped it. Just the sensation of being observed from a distance so close it felt like intrusion. A memory swelled up in my chest with sudden clarity. Me at 6 years old, sitting alone in that same room, whispering a wish into the dark that someone would hear me. I hadn't realized the walls, the wires, the quiet frequencies that drifted through the house at night were listening. This figure wasn't new. It was the echo of that wish, shaped over years, drawn to every lonely breath I ever released. It grew in the silence between my heartbeat and the hum of the radio, forming itself around every moment I felt unseen. And now it wanted to step fully into the space it had grown inside me. The room bent inward. The shadows thickened. The radio let out a final, elongated tone that stretched until it became nothing but pressure, a sustained vibration that filled every inch of air. My body swayed forward uncontrollably, drawn toward the desk, toward the signal, toward the presence that hovered just behind me. My vision blurred. My thoughts thinned into strands of noise. I felt myself slipping, not falling to the floor, but falling inward, sinking into that low hum, as if it were a doorway. The figure pressed closer, its shape merging with my own shadow on the wall. The hum rose sharply, then dropped into absolute stillness. And in that stillness, something inside me opened. Not a sound, not a word, a space. A space carved by years of loneliness, now occupied by a presence that had waited patiently in the dark between frequencies. The room no longer felt like mine. My thoughts no longer felt like mine. My shadow no longer moved like mine. The figure settled behind me, claiming the silence I once filled with hopes I barely understood. The radio continued its faint static, the last thread connecting me to what I used to be. I stood in the center of that small room, unable to move, unable to think beyond the slow rhythm pulsing in my chest, a rhythm that no longer matched my own heartbeat. The presence had stepped fully through the signal, and there was no space left inside me that hadn't made room for it. I had wished for someone to hear me, and now something did, completely. There was no escape from the silence. Now, it belonged to us both.